Welcome to Strip Cover Lit. I'm Dalton Gentry. And we have some unfinished business to attend here on Fridays on Strip Cover Lit, and that is How to Read Books Good, a breakdown of how to read literature like a professor by Thomas C. Foster. And we left off last, quite a while ago, with Chapter 7. We talked a little bit about fairy tales in literature, and today we are going to continue forward with that, which has been the theme for the last few episodes of this. And we are going to be talking about Chapter 8 of How to Read Literature Like a Professor, and that is entitled, It's Greek to Me. Now, that is going to lead you to understand what we are talking about today. We have talked a lot about how all good literature is stolen from somewhere, whether it's Shakespeare, whether it's the Bible, whether it's children's fairy tales, or the next big player in this lovely little cluster of things that we steal from, Greek mythos. And not just Greek, any mythos we can steal great literature from, because there is something about a myth that kind of draws us together as human beings. It connects us. It is a part of, a large part of a group of people's culture, something that we can easily identify with. Now, Greek myth is a big player, but it is not all about Greek myths. From page 60 of How to Read Literature Like a Professor. What we mean in speaking of myth in general is story, the ability of story to explain ourselves to ourselves in ways that physics, philosophies, mathematics, chemistry, all very useful and informative in their own right, can't. That explanation takes the shape of stories that are deeply ingrained in our group memory, that shape our culture and are, in turn, shaped by it. That constitutes a way of seeing by which we read the world and ultimately ourselves. Let's say it this way. Myth is a body of story that matters. So, once we look into the idea of myths, and we're going to focus a lot on Greek myths here because that seems to be the primary focus of the chapter, and honestly, it's a very simple one to address. We have these stories that are dated hundreds of thousands years ago, that still ring true today, that can still be found in our modern literature, and that constantly pop up, and there's nothing wrong with that. We've talked about that a lot in the past, about how this idea of stealing from literature is not a bad thing, because we can always revise something, we can always comment further, and we can always kind of move that conversation forward in literature, even if we're referencing things that happened thousands of years ago. So, we can draw parallels from pretty much anything, and we can always kind of connect them back to this idea of a Greek myth, and that's what makes a great story, is when you can take this idea and kind of connect it with the past. From page 63. One moment, because I don't know how to turn pages. As someone who was a teenager in the 60s, I am reminded by the fate of Icarus, of all those kids who bought muscle cars with names like Mustang and Firebird and Charger and Barracuda. All the driver education and solid parental advice in the world can't overcome the allure of that kind of power, and sadly, in too many cases, those young drivers shared the fate of Icarus. My students, somewhat younger than I, will inevitably draw other parallels. Still, it all goes back to the myth, the boy, the wings, the unscheduled dive. Now, of course, this is talking about the Greek myth of Icarus, the man who flew too close to the sun with his father's wings. And those father's wings came from his father. That's terribly worded. My apology. I'm not editing. This came from Daedalus, his father. And Daedalus sounds a little familiar. Sounds like something we may have addressed once before in this channel, because James Joyce loved himself some Greek myth. Now, I have not personally read Ulysses because, no, I'm not ready for that. But I have read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and I do know that the main character is named Stephen Daedalus, which leads that idea of what can we draw from this here? Why is that character named Daedalus? That leads us to believe that, one, maybe his father passed this name on to him. Maybe his father is going to give him gifts, give him opportunities, and maybe young Stephen's going to fly a little bit too close to the sun and get burnt. Now, that plays out a little strangely in A Portrait of the Artist, the Young Man. I think there's some great parallels that you can draw from that, a lot of which we addressed in our full review of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which I would suggest you check out. But, again, we see these common themes, these common names, these common ideas coming from Greek myth being incorporated into modern literature. Again, we're stealing, and it's a great thing. Now, when we look at stealing from other pieces of literature, when we're trying to connect it all together in this, it's much better worded by Thomas Foster. I'm terrible at wording things on the fly. The explanation takes shape of stories that are deeply ingrained in our group memory that share our culture and are in turn shaped by it. Now, when we look at that, it always comes back to the perception of the reader, because we can play with ironies, we can play with differences, we can use these myths to kind of play a different point if we want, but it always comes down to the perception of the reader. From 59 of How to Read Literature Like a Professor. Here in this activity of reading and understanding literature, we're chiefly concerned with how the story functions as material for literary creators, that way in which it can inform a story or a poem, and how it is perceived by the reader. So that is the trick of the writer right there, is we can take the idea of a Greek myth, we could turn it on its head and play off of the irony, but the reader will connect with it and be like, oh, I understand this. This is from this Greek myth. How ironic that we're taking this turn here. Or maybe we can take that myth itself and just completely re-envision it, put it in a modern setting, and not address the fact that it is this myth itself. The readers will again create that psychological connection with the text. They'll understand it a little bit better, and when it finally does click, if this is the Odyssey, then you have something special, because the reader can then identify with what's going on. They can see things that maybe aren't within the text because they understand the former text from which it is stolen. Now, shared human experiences and culture, that seems to be the goal with these past four little bits that we have talked about here: stealing from Shakespeare, stealing from the Bible, children's fairy tales, and finally myth. And myth is something we talk about quite frequently on Strip Cover Lit. We always refer to the mythos that is being built by the writer. And it's a little bit different. Mythos is something that the writer is building up, but oftentimes these are kind of intertwined. There are other things at play here. We talked a lot in the Harry Potter series about the different myths that are being built upon. We talked about the centaurs. These are classical creatures from the antiquities of literature, and how, because what they represent in these former texts, we can interpret new things in these new texts. The centaurs did not take Dolores Umbridge into the woods and talk sternly to her. Things happened because we have that myth of the centaurs to build from. Now, there are a couple more examples that we use here on Strip Cover Lit that you may be able to identify, and a few others that you may have seen in your personal life that would help you better understand how this idea of the Greek myth can be put into literature and film as well. Film's fun to play with. We talked a lot about Stephen Daedalus. James Joyce loves himself some Greek myth. You can check out Ulysses. You can check out Stephen Daedalus from A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. You're going to find a lot of parallels from within either of those texts. If you've ever seen the 2000s film Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which I have an unhealthy love for, you might recognize it's the Odyssey. And that's not really a big kept secret. That is something that's played upon. It's a modern interpretation of the Odyssey. I believe there's even a quote from the Odyssey that starts the film off. But this is that modern interpretation. This is something that we can take from a classic piece of literature, reinterpret in a modern sense, and still get the same results. It's a great thing. Finally, talking a little bit about YA. A while back, there was a hugely popular series by Rick Riordan, Percy Jackson and the Olympians. Ironically enough, Thomas C. Foster actually ends his discussion with this. And it's something that immediately came to mind as soon as we started reading this chapter. I'm like, oh, we're going to talk about Percy Jackson a little bit on the episode. But thank you, Thomas Foster, for beating me to it. This was a young adult series that drew 100% from Greek myth. It took a lot of different elements. These are basically, these are the children of gods. And they have all these great powers that are imbued within them. And we are going to see, I believe, one of the first books you get an encounter with basically Medusa. So these are classic ideas that are coming from texts long, long ago that are still being utilized today. So, hopefully at this point we can put this idea of stealing literature from the past and from other pieces of literature, we're going to put that to rest, because I think we're going to move on from this in the next chapter of How to Read Literature Like a Professor by Thomas C. Foster, which is It's More Than Just Rain or Snow. So I assume we're going to be talking a lot about symbolism next week on Strip Cover Lit, because we are back with How to Read Books Good, a full breakdown and interpretation of How to Read Literature Like a Professor by Thomas C. Foster. If you like this kind of thing, make sure you hit the subscribe button down below. Give this video a like as well, and please leave me a comment because it always makes me feel good when you say that you enjoy this program. And if you'd like to help us create more great content like this here on Strip Cover Lit, there's a link to our newly updated Patreon to be found in the description below.